Okay, so this is a recording of our first lecture of 121, and the subject is 2.5. I apologize, I have a little bit of a cold still, so I might be a little bit sniffly and sneezy and coughy. I'll try to keep that to a minimum. As a reminder, there is that worksheets for kind of each section for you to kind of ideally have printed out and follow along with the lecture with, and answer questions as we're going along. So it might be a good idea to have those printed out, or maybe watch the video through and then print it out and try and kind of work through on your own. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the zero product property. This is a property that you guys probably know, maybe you haven't really explicitly have written out. But essentially what it says is that if I know two things that are multiplied together are equal to 0, then either the first thing is equal to 0 or the second thing is equal to 0. And we use it a lot when we're factoring because it allows us to solve for x once we have all of our individual factors. So in this question, we have something that's already been factored. We have something that would result in x minus 3 times 2x plus 5 is equal to 0. And now I can use the zero product property to set each part equal to 0 to solve for x. So set the first factor, x minus 3 equal to 0. Pretty easy to solve that guy. I add 3 to both sides, and I get the result that x is equal to 3. Now I can do the same thing with my other factor. 2x plus 5 is equal to 0. The problem-solving process is a little bit more complicated, but it's not super difficult. I would subtract 5 from both sides. I'd get 2x is equal to negative 5. Then I would divide both sides by 2, giving my result of x is equal to negative 5 halves. Now, this section is really going to focus on a lot of different ways to solve quadratics. A quadratic is something that has x squared or y squared, something to the second power in it. So this is the first 4 minutes called simple factoring. It's not an ideal term for that because, I mean, factoring isn't the most simplest thing in the world, but of the methods that we're going to see, this process is definitely the least involved. And so in order to do simple factoring, what we have to do is we have to have 0 on one side of the equation. So if I'm going to try and factor this equation that I have, x squared plus 5x is equal to negative 6, then I add 6 to both sides, and I get 0 on the other side. So eventually when I get done with the factoring, I can use the zero product property and solve. Now to factor in the simplest form, what I do is I look at the last term, the term that doesn't have an x in it, and I look at my middle term, the term that has an x but not x squared. And I want to find two numbers that multiply to get me the last number, in this case 6, and add to get me the middle number, in this case 5. And it's usually easiest to kind of look at the multiply part of the equation because there's only so many things, or at least so many nice things, that can multiply to 6. So when I think about this problem, I think, okay, what multiplies to 6? Well, 1 times 6 does, but that doesn't add to 5. 2 times 3 gets me 6, and 2 plus 3 gets me 5. And so I've kind of solved the problem. I've guessed and checked and figured out what two numbers multiply to get me 6, add to get me 5. And so then I just rewrite my thing in factored form. My factored form will be a parentheses. It'll be, the fancy name's a binomial, but it'll be x plus my first number, which is 2, and x plus my second number, which is 3. So x plus 2 times x plus 3. Order doesn't really matter with factoring. So you could also write x plus 3 times x plus 2 is equal to 0, and that's perfectly fine. Well, now using the strategy that we talked about on the previous slide, we set both parts equal to 0 and solve. In this case, it's a one-step process, so I didn't really write it out explicitly, but I would subtract 2 from both sides. I get x equals negative 2. And I would subtract 3 from both sides and get x is equal to negative 3. Now, checking your answers is a very valuable thing throughout this course, and if you wanted to, you certainly could in this case. You would take those numbers, plug it back into the original equation, and then if you follow order of operations, you should get a negative 6 on the left side and a negative 6 on the right side, and that should work for both of these answers. If they don't, you might have made a mistake, maybe picked the wrong things when you're factoring. Definitely worth looking into, especially as we start to get into more difficult examples. Okay, now a more involved process is factor by grouping, and although it does have a lot more steps, it always works when we're factoring, where the previous method, the simple factoring, only works if we see this equation up top, if there is no a. So if we see something like this equation, 4x squared minus 13x plus 3, I can't just use simple factoring on it because I have something in front of my x squared. In particular, I have 4. So I'm going to use this method of factor by grouping. My first step is I multiply the first term and the last term. So I multiply the 4 by the 3. And I'm going to kind of organize my information over here. So 4 times 3 is 12. I'm going to make an x. You don't have to make an x. I just found that helpful when I've been teaching this course to organize my information. So I'm going to put the 12 on the top part of my x. And then I'm going to put that middle term of my equation, the negative 13, I'm going to put that on the bottom of my x. And now I play the same game that I played on the previous slide. I want to find two things that multiply to get me 12 and add to get me negative 13. Well, I've obviously done this problem before, but that might take you some time. Eventually, hopefully, you'll be able to guess, well, negative 12 times negative 1 gets me 12, and negative 12 plus negative 1 gets me negative 13. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite my equation with this new information. In particular, I'm not going to change the first term at all. I'm not going to change the last term at all. I still have my 4x squared. I still have my 3. I'm going to change my middle term. So I broke up my middle term and I took that negative 12 from that big X on the top right. And I took the negative 1 from that as well. And so I'm going to rewrite my equation as 4x squared minus 12x minus 1x plus 3 is equal to 0. Now, where the title comes from, the factor by grouping, is at this point I'm going to group the first two terms and I'm going to group the last two terms. And after I've done that, my goal is to now figure out what fits into both of those first two terms, only those first two terms for starters. So I look at that, I have 4x squared and I have negative 12x. Well, the biggest number, and we need to find the biggest number that fits into both of those is 4, and x fits into both of those terms. So what I would do is I say, okay, well, 4x fits into both of those terms. I'm going to divide both terms by 4x. And so that first part now becomes 4x times x minus 3. 4x squared divided by 4x gets you x. And negative 12x divided by 4x gets you negative 3. And now I'm going to repeat the process for the next group, that negative 1x plus 3. Now you might be thinking, well, there's no x's in both terms, so I can't factor out an x, and there's really no number bigger than 1 that fits into both of them, so I can't really do anything with that. But one cool feature of a factor by grouping is that if you're doing everything correctly, then your two factors in this step that we're on right now need to match. And so my first factor, I have x minus 3. I want to make it so I have x minus 3 in my second, and I currently don't have that. So to resolve that, I'm going to pull out a negative 1 out of both terms. And by pulling out, and I should have said this in the first thing, I'm dividing both terms by negative 1. So I go ahead and do that, and I put the negative 1 in front, and then negative 1x divided by negative 1 gets me x. 3 divided by negative 1 gets me negative 3. And now notice here I have matching. That's the goal. If you're not matching in this step, you did something wrong. Maybe you didn't pull out a big enough factor above, or maybe you needed to pull out a negative, or maybe you didn't pick the correct factors up in that big X that we had, the negative 12 and the negative 1. So that's a nice little checkpoint. And so since they are matching, we did it correct, or we probably did it correct. And so I look at the two terms in front of my groups, so the 4x and the negative 1, and that becomes one of my factors. And then my other factor is the thing that matched up my pair. I have my pair of x minus 3's, and so that's going to be my second factor. And now I have my factored form, 4x minus 1 times x minus 3. And if I wanted to check with the factoring at this point, I could multiply that back. I would get all the way back to the start of my problem. So now I'm going to use, again, the zero product property to solve. I'll set the first factor equal to 0 and the second factor equal to 0. Solve the first one using some basic algebra. I add 1 to both sides. I get 4x is equal to 1. Divide 4 from both sides. I get x is equal to 1/4. And then the next equation is a one-step problem. I just add 3 to both sides and I get x equals 3. Now, well, the title of this section is Quadratic Equations or Quadratic Functions. So if you see a question like this, you might think, well, okay, now I do have an x squared, but I have an x cubed. I have something bigger. And this is called a cubic. And so to kind of deal with that, we're going to use a similar idea, similar concept. We're going to move everything to one side. We're going to get a 0 on the other side of the equation. Now, ideally, it would be nice to make this or turn this into a quadratic, because then we could use the strategies we've seen on the last 2 slides. Well, we can actually do just that by taking out the greatest common factor, which in this case is x. I can pull an x out of all 3 terms. So I would divide each term by x. Well, x cubed divided by x becomes x squared. Negative 2x squared divided by x gets me 2x. And negative 3x squared divided by x gets me negative 3. And now I have a quadratic inside of the parentheses. So I'm still going to solve for x eventually, but now I'm just going to solve for my x squared minus 2x minus 3. Well, I guess I solve for it immediately in this question. So now x is equal to 0 is still one answer. And so to find my other x's, I'm going to take that stuff inside the parentheses, and then I'm going to factor it again. And this one is kind of a nice simple factoring question. I'm going to look for 2 things that multiply to get me negative 3 and add to get me negative 2. Well, negative 3 times 1 gets me negative 3. Negative 3 plus 1 gets me negative 2. Those are my 2 factors. I set them each equal to 0 and solve. So I get the result x equals 3 and x equals negative 1. So I get 3 answers.